Could Tolkien's orcs be incarnated demonic spirits? An invited guest post by commenter WW. Bruce Charlton. What follows is a guest post by commenter WW, which I invited him to contribute on the basis of several very interesting comments on this theme. Could Tolkien's orcs be incarnated demonic spirits? It was hard for Tolkien to describe the history and nature of orcs to his own satisfaction, and the problem has continued among his commentators. I will suggest that orcs were constructed from material bodies made to house Melkor/Morgoth's demon followers in a form that could procreate on Middle-earth. Sauron, as the heir of Morgoth, was later able to accelerate, expand, and modify orc proliferation, and this may be the reason he was referred to as the necromancer. Background. It is my belief that although consigned to existing as spirits today, there was a time that demons existed as mortal beings on this earth, a large number of them in the form of what we would call orcs, but never men. In addition, I also believe that there are demon beings that were incarnated in some form prior to the creation of this earth, and therefore subsequent to their own reincarnation here. Orc actually means demon in Old English, and so language, as something Tolkien used as the foundation for his stories, might give us the first clue, or at least a sense of permission, that exploring this line of thinking between demons and orcs might not be completely without merit. To understand the basis for this belief, I would first reference Mormon theology and creation myth. In writings known to Mormons as the Pearl of Great Price, Abraham is shown a vision of the state of affairs leading up to the creation of this earth. In that vision, he sees two groups of beings, souls and spirits. The souls I take as being those with bodies, this being consistent with the definition of a soul in other parts of Mormon teachings. Regarding the spirits, I am unsure as to whether they may have had bodies prior to when Abraham sees them. As such, I wouldn't be able to say at this time whether they had always been spirits, or at some point also had bodies and through events and circumstance found themselves without them. Regardless, it seems at the time of the creation of the earth they were spirits. Among the embodied souls were those named noble and great ones, which Abraham was told he had been a part of, who were tasked by God to be rulers for the spirits and, as I take it, learn from and work with God to bring about the salvation of those spirits. Part of that commission was in the creation of this world for those spirits to inhabit. How that played out, I think, is very similar to what Tolkien wrote of in the Ainulindale, and in my own thinking I use his terms, Valar, Maya, and even the Eldar/Elves, etc. to describe the different groups of the embodied individuals who assisted with that creation. I will note, but won't expand here in the discussion of demons and orcs, that among the Valar were the lead powers known as the Aratar, or noble, exalted ones, which correlate to Joseph Smith's noble and great ones just mentioned, and which Abraham was a part of, although obviously known by a different name. Unlike these great ones and other bodied individuals, the spirits, however, would not have directly participated in this creation. They would ultimately incarnate here as men, and their non-participation in the creation of this earth may be one reason why elves and other beings noted that they seemed strangers to it. The rebellion of Melkor and his demonic spirit followers. Just as in both the Ainulindale and in Mormon teachings, Satan Melkor rebelled and sowed discord prior to and during Earth's creation, launching a war or conflict in heaven, and ultimately drawing away a significant number of beings to his cause. These followers of Satan Melkor would have consisted of both other embodied souls as well as spirits. In the case of previously embodied demons, Balrogs would be an example, as would other power-seeking Maya like Sauron. As for the spirits who followed Satan Melkor, these would have become demons also, and it is these, specifically, that I believe were incarnated as orcs once Melkor found a way to make this possible. It is important to note here that what a being became leading up to this point was a result of their choices. God did not make good and evil beings, or any beings at all, but rather through their own choices and agency, already existing beings became or revealed themselves as good or evil actors. In other words, demons, at least at first, actively made choices that turned them into such. I say at first, because in the making of their choices, they also turned themselves into slaves, servants of Satan Melkor, and thus were left with very little choice at all in the end but to remain in that state, with no hope for repentance, at least in this story. There may be other stories and some other creation for them, but not here. It is because of this lack of choice and state of slavery they found themselves in, that I believe once Satan Melkor chose to incarnate and become part of this creation, the demons would have no choice but to also follow their master and aid him. When he called, they had to come, even if they would have wished not to incarnate on this earth at all. It was not their choice to make. The bodies of orcs. Drawing again on Mormon theology, it would appear that the bodies that housed elves and men were originally created with enmity or protection that prevented evil spirits from being born into them. As in, only the children of God, men and elves, could be born into the bodies that had been created for them. Thus, Melkor could not simply take these bodies as they were and put his own followers into them. If one of his objectives was to bring his servants into this earth with him, and I believe it was, he would need to find another means to do so. Having no original creative power himself, he would need to rely on his ability to take already existing creation and twist/mar it into something fit for his purpose. As Tolkien relates, Melkor imprisoned and tortured elves and men from the very beginning, and although not known exactly how or ever consistently resolved by either in story characters or out of story guesses or communications by the author and others, to my knowledge, at least, it seems clear that these actions in some way resulted in the orc. One line of thinking has been that these orcs were literally the identities or spirits of elves and men twisted to Melkor's service through this torture and entrapment. My own view, and one of the main assumptions underpinning this post, is otherwise. Rather, this twisting actually involved Melkor taking these bodies created for Jesus Eru's children, and finding a way around the enmity or original protection designed into them. Thus, perverting God's initial creation to be suitable to house his demon slaves. To say more clearly, he would have used the bodies of elves and men he captured to conduct experiments on how to get around the protection, using his ability to twist and corrupt matter and creation to his purposes, which was to have bodies/vessels, for his slaves to use in joining him in this creation. He could not, however, design the bodies to have the same fair form as elves and men. The changes required would have had to be too radical to preserve that. Rather, these orc bodies would have had to be marred and twisted to such a degree as to be differentiate significantly from the original creation, not ever to be confused with it. Where the bodies for Eru's children were for joy and happiness, even though marred and fallen to some extent, the orc bodies seemed miserable, meant for pain, fear, and hate. How Melkor was able to accomplish this great perversion and thus house his demon followers would not be known today, for good reason. Through the first 3 ages of the world, it seems that once created, orcs were able to procreate just as men and elves did and thus provide a natural means for demons to incarnate on Earth. Sauron and even Saruman were able to accelerate, expand, and modify orc proliferation to their own ends even after Melkor was banished, probably relying on some knowledge of his dark arts to accomplish this, with added experiments of their own, perhaps. Specifically, Sauron's involvement in these dark arts may be why he was referred to as the necromancer in The Hobbit and LOTR. Following the War of Wrath, it seems the orcs were largely eliminated, or went underground/into hiding. The re-emergence of Sauron seems to have been strongly correlated with the re-emergence and building of the orc hordes, perhaps due to his direct involvement and carrying over the practices learned from his former master. As a quick tangent, and not to overly complicate things, Sauron's necromancy also may have involved rehousing the spirits of evil men into various physical forms and bodies. These would not have been orcs, however, or really demons, but rather men who chose evil and became Sauron's servants. The king's men of Númenor, becoming the Black Númenóreans, would be included. Perhaps the mouth of Sauron was just such a being, an evil man housed unnaturally and given long life as a result in Sauron's service. In any case, in the years following the Third Age and the War of the Ring, the orcs were made extinct. With no orcs left to create other orcs, and with Melkor, Sauron, and Saruman all gone, there was no knowledge left, apparently, on how to start again and create bodies to rehouse their spirits. This is why we would not expect to see demons in bodily form today, but only experience them through spirit-mind afflictions. Since they were not born as men, and have no path of being so, these once embodied demons have no hope of a resurrection, since that is the path that Jesus Eru set. Implications of orcs being demons. One test or approach Bruce suggested to assess the possibility of whether demons were once orcs was to compare the morality and behavior of orcs, from what we can read, with that of demons. It is a good suggestion. My sense in doing so is that we should expect to find some inconsistencies, however, perhaps significant ones, along with some consistencies. An explanation for why might lie in assessing our own behavior and situation as mortals on Earth. It is likely, in my opinion, there is a core to ourselves, our own being and personality, that persists through time and various transformations but may be altered, sometimes significantly, depending on the bodies we take up and circumstances we come into. Therefore, demon/orc behavior and morality may have also altered with them taking on bodies, and so one wouldn't expect that their behavior to be perfectly consistent between their spirit and embodied states. In other words, we, as fallen men, might in many ways be unrecognizable to our former and future selves were we to see ourselves in those states, and so the demons who became orcs might have been altered similarly during their mortal experience, particularly with being subject to pain and all other things a body brings. As noted earlier, theirs does not seem to be a particularly happy experience, obviously, perhaps both due to the nature of their spirits but also the nature of the cruel bodies that were made for them to take on. In further assessing and, in my case, dismissing whether orcs were actually just as men and elves, but corrupted, there are some hints within the text of the LOTR itself. As one example, there is an interesting dialogue between Treebeard, Merry, and Pippin, that may shed some light, or at least give us a window into Treebeard's understanding of the origin of orcs. In the dialogue, Treebeard suggests that orcs are counterfeits of elves, created by the enemy, just as trolls were counterfeits of ents. But in saying this, Treebeard states that trolls were never ents, don't possess their same strength, etc., and so one might infer that elves are referred to in that same sense. A cruel mockery of God's initial creation, but not actually the beings of elves turned into orcs, which wouldn't be referred to as merely a counterfeit, but rather as the real thing corrupted. Additionally, one would need to ask that if the orcs did procreate as men and elves, and were also comprised of a spirit with a body, then what spirits are they? I can't imagine that Eru would have allowed any of his children or the spirits aligned with good to be forced into those bodies. They would have had to come from somewhere else, and existing hordes of demon spirits/Melkor slaves may be the best solution as to what, then, would be expected to be housed in these bodies. Meaning, Melkor, and later Sauron and Saruman, would have had to draw from an already existing pool of evil spirit slaves, made slaves due to their choices before this creation, as mentioned before, to support their orc armies. Lastly, and not happily, I suggest that while the orcs are relegated to spirit-only forms now, there may, in fact, still be embodied demons here on, or within, Earth, and so we aren't left with a completely houseless demon horde to deal with. In saying this, I do not think it would be many, perhaps only a couple/few. These beings would be known as Balrogs, I suppose, and would have been driven to or found hiding in the deep places of the earth, similar to the Balrog that the Fellowship encountered in Moria. I have no other insight into this than my own experience and intuition, and so this is probably the most speculative notion of an extremely speculative train of thought. I view the current orc demon horde as largely mindless servants of evil. With Melkor and Sauron gone, however, they may still operate under the direction of these embodied evil beings in hiding, and thus what we see on display in our own world is the influence of these Balrogs, who are very aware and cunning, spreading through their demon spirits hordes and into the minds of men. Concentrations of demonic influence in our current world might actually serve as clues as to where these Balrogs are located physically and or the topics, concerns, and strategies on which they are largely focused, and which may and probably do differ between, and sometimes conflict with, other Balrogs, demon leaders. There are happier topics to think on, obviously. And I guess in some ways one really only wants to take this so far as to understand the nature of the evil one is up against, and no further if not absolutely necessary. That is the approach I have tried to follow. So, while I definitely would hope for clarification, correction, or confirmation on much that I have written and guessed at here, I would hope it continues to be in the context of a much larger and better story about the good forces and powers at work, and our ultimate redemption. Note from author WW. In another post, Bruce explored the nature of demons and posed some thoughts suggesting that they may never be incarnated. This post picks up and explores an alternative view, and represents a collection and expansion of some thoughts in the comments section of that post, that there may be reason to believe that demons, at least many of them, actually have been incarnated at one time on this earth. In exploring this possibility, I have drawn on the stories and mythologies of Tolkien's Legendarium, and Joseph Smith's Mormonism, for lack of better descriptors. There may be other ways to understand these things, but these are languages and stories that I am most familiar with, and so that is what I have used. This is also a part and ongoing work of imagination at this point for me, but imagination meant to help me understand reality. As such, I am not arguing that what I write here is necessarily true, but it does reflect my current understanding of how things may be. I am also not arguing that Tolkien or Joseph Smith intended these interpretations, or even considered them, in their writings. So please take this post in that spirit, and I would expect there to be a wide range of opinions on this matter, as nothing I find is definitive, and my train of thought is speculative. My own views and guesses continue to evolve, and some of what is written here will most likely be wrong. But there is potentially enough right to not throw it out completely. I also have not really been focusing on orcs or demons in my own thinking up to this point, for good reason. So much of what I try to summarize here is based on or gleaned from efforts focused on other, more positive topics. This is another reason that some details about orcs here may not be completely right, or some of my assumptions and conclusions thought through as well as they ought to have been. Implications of modern man's waning capacity to pool consciousness and generate thought forms / elementals / egregores / dynamic archetypes. Bruce Charlton. I have been rereading Dion Fortune's Applied Magic, and thinking about her descriptions and discussions of thought forms. These are essentially the same phenomena variously called elementals, egregores and dynamic archetypes. These hypothetical entities are generated by the pooled consciousness of a group of people, attain some kind of separate agency, and then act back to influence or indeed control that same group. So, a group of people whose attention is focused and motivated is posited to undergo a merging of thought to generate an entity that then develops a life of its own such that, depending upon its nature and orientation, will then drive the group towards those goals, and by those methods, with which it was established. In sum, there is a reciprocal relation between group and thought form, and the though form depends on the group for its original form, energy and continued existence, but the thought form may develop in new directions and impose these on the group, and the individuals in the group are also subjugated to the thought form and cannot easily or always, withdraw assent and membership. I will here assume that, if not an exact formulation, these thought forms are at least potentially real phenomena. In fact, I am going to argue that the ability to generate thought forms was essentially universal among men, at least until the end of the medieval period in Europe, but that this was a phase in the development of human consciousness that has now dwindled to almost vestigial levels of power. This is because the ability to generate thought forms by group pooling of consciousness is double-edged, because it is also a vulnerability to control by thought forms, directly a vulnerability to being controlled by an irresistible thought form, and indirectly to being controlled by the group in which an individual is participating. Which is to say that thought forms are experienced as overwhelming, universal, to the group, mandatory, and, in a word, as objective reality. Therefore, thought forms of this kind are what Owen Barfield, in Saving the Appearances, calls collective representations. Taking up the ideas of Owen Barfield, and Rudolf Steiner, concerning the evolutionary development of human consciousness, I am struck by how deftly this can be applied to the changing capacity/vulnerability of humans to thought forms. In brief, I regard known history as one in which humans, at different rates in different places and among different peoples, are gradually losing the pooled consciousness that was at first natural and spontaneous, then became a product of ritual, symbolism, use of sacred texts and traditions etc., which can be understood psychologically as inculcating associations and building them among groups to reach the desired state of pooled consciousness. This then becomes the basic of social cohesion and purpose. Dion Fortune was writing as a ritual magician active in the 1920s and 30s, and at that time it was still possible for selected and highly motivated groups of people, i.e. members of magical lodges, to be trained in concentration, control of emotions, and the use of symbolism and ritual, to attain that pooled consciousness and generation of objective thought forms, which had receded from the population at large. The thought forms might be positive and benign, as with the height magic Dion Fortune's Christian mysticism, or negative and malign, self-gratifying, and manipulative, as with Aleister Crowley and other black magicians. But generation of benign, positive, and overwhelmingly powerful thought forms by groups became more difficult and rarer through the 20th century, and, I infer from my reading in the field, not from experience, had essentially ceased by the millennium. Nowadays, white magical rituals apparently have an as-if quality, more like attending a drama than being irresistibly affected by objective reality. And the same applies to Western churches. Whereas they once had the ability to generate positive thought forms that would then impose upon members, not this has waned in strength such that all the churches are overwhelmed, and have been reorientated, by the mainstream globalist, totalitarian ideology. What of this totalitarian ideology? Is this a thought form? If so, is it really weak? The answer is yes, it is a thought form and it is weak. The fact that the totalitarian ideology must command the attention and motivation of hundreds of millions of people is precisely because the levels of attention and motivation are so weak. Yet people no longer experience this ideology as objectively real, and require a continuous and escalating level of media propaganda combined with exclusion of alternatives in order to make it effective. Furthermore, the content of the mainstream ideology is negative. It can only generate even minimal levels of motivation by inducing negative, sinful, emotions such as fear, resentment and despair. And, even so, these strategically induced mega-mass thought forms are only temporarily effective, and need to be swapped around, and novelties introduced, every few months. What, then, is God's positive purpose behind this development of consciousness away from groups pooling and making thoughts forms? The answer is that the loss of pooling is a consequence of the increased autonomy of thinking, the greater potential strength of individual thinking. We are less passively controlled, because we are more actively generative. Less immersed in what seems objective because we are able to range across reality in the primary thinking of our divine selves. We are now more able to resist the influence of thought forms, and domination by the group, and this works both ways, resistance to good group influences and evil. We choose and make that reality we live by. This choosing is necessary, because we cannot pool with a group, and also, therefore, the direction of choice is also an unavoidable personal responsibility. Each man now has the capability consciously to resist any and all external influences, to think for himself, and therefore to become able to pursue his own unique destiny through this mortal life. This is possible, despite that vastness of negative global totalitarian thought forms, because these are low-density elementals, they are experienced as diffuse archetypes, that, at the point of impact upon us, are not able to exert the irresistible, and often unconscious, pressure of ancient thought forms. Now, exactly because modern consciousness is cut off and self-conscious, the thought forms generated by our attention and chosen source of motivation, are unique and individually tailored. Each person's positive, God-aligned, thought form is, by analogy, high in density, resistant to subverting influences, and in its motion powered by that which our deepest intuitions tell us is true, beautiful and virtuous. An individual thought form can therefore work like a knife whose edge can penetrate through any amount of the toxic gaseous influences of mega-mass ideology. In other words, our positive personal thought form, when motivated by faith and harmonious with divine creation, can beat a whole world of shifting negations. Evil is incremental, but good is qualitative. Bruce Charlton. People have a false idea about the nature of good, a false understanding which itself often leads to evil. I think part of the problem is the tendency among intellectuals to seek symmetry in concepts, as if symmetry was to be expected. Whereas, it seems to me, that, aside from structures, genuine symmetry is rare and exceptional in this world. So the usual assumption is that good and evil are two sides of a coin, or a continuum. Or even that pernicious idea that good is a happy medium between two extremes of evil. We all know from observation, and experience, that evil is incremental, and that people can be corrupted gradually, step by step, by pushing them further and further into doing, and not repenting, evil acts until the person joins with the side of evil. We can observe this gradual, insensible corruption among our acquaintances, in society at large, and perhaps we have seen the same in ourselves. There seems to be a general idea that affiliation to the good can be accomplished likewise. The idea that we can increase faith, reach towards a godly, or Christ-like, state, can become better Christians, by incremental steps of doing more and more good acts. That seems to be a covert assumption under which many churches operate, the assumption that if churches can get people doing more and more good things, they will gradually become stronger and more secure in faith. Furthermore, there is an assumption that a partial good has the tendency to lead on to affiliation to overall good. So that if a person is dedicated to some good like the beauty of music, or the truth of science, or has adopted some partially valid spirituality, such as Western Buddhism, or Jungian psychology, then all such things are steps in the right direction, and will tend to develop Christian affiliations. Well, these are empirical claims. That is, they are not self-evident, but are claims about the nature of human beings and how the world works. I do not agree that this is how the world works. In contrast with evil, I regard good as a qualitative, not quantitative, thing, and therefore not capable of being adopted by increments. While it is true that evil acts tend to lead to corruption, desensitization, and towards an affiliation with the side of Satan, I believe the situation is utterly different with good. Good works do not lead to strong faith, as can easily be observed in the mainstream Christian churches, especially in relation to the Birdemic and Peck. In early 2020, mainstream Western churches, including those known for exceptionally good behavior and acts of charity, all, and without any apparent soul-searching or crisis of conscience, quickly and comfortably made strong affirmations of their affiliation with the side of global totalitarian bureaucratic materialism. That is, they adopted the materialist healthism behind the Birdemic scam, while many have since adopted one or more of the litmus test issues by which totalitarianism is pursuing its goals: anti-racism, climate change, the sexual revolution and transgender, and the rest of them. From this gross failure of the true spiritual mission of the churches, it ought to be evident that partial goods do not reliably tend to lead towards the affirmations of Christianity, or at least not on a detectable time scale. What instead happens is that most people get stuck on partial goods, convinced of their goodness but unable to perceive or unwilling to acknowledge the limitations of their perspective, and thereby blocked from making the necessary deep and existential commitment to God's agenda which their behavior contradicts. For instance, Jungian psychology is a partial good if compared with the gross reductionism of mainstream materialism. Yet it is a very partial, radically incomplete, perspective that accepts many of the errors and distortions of positivistic scientism, and which tries to be agnostic about the reality of a personal God, when agnosticism is de facto equivalent to atheism. Consequently, most Jungians have taken the side of evil, and are deeply committed to aspects of the agenda of evil. Yet, despite its innate contradictions and metaphysical gaps and blockages, people get stuck in Jungianism, and, in effect, try to solve its deep incoherence by a lifetime of superficial tinkering. This happens frequently, because the problems of good and evil are often metaphysical, that is, they are due to primary assumptions concerning the nature of reality. To become a Christian entails believing that there is a personal God who is creator, who is good, and of whom we are children, and then making an inner commitment to live our lives eternally in harmony with the purposes of such a God. Such fundamental assumptions and decisions are not a conclusion of incremental life experiences. Accomplishing acts of charity, devotion, worship, learning. These do not lead people by step towards adopting such an overall worldview and affiliation. Nor does dedication to the partial and this worldly goods of creating aesthetic beauty, pursuing the truths of scholarship, or healing of the sick. Good is thus qualitative, because God is qualitative, and because our choice to work with, or against, God is qualitative. Either we adopt such an affiliation, or we do not. Someone who affiliates to good is good in spiritual terms, even when he does not do many good acts. Conversely, someone who leads a life of service and does many good works, may be and often is on the side of spiritual evil. The good works have not prevented him from serving the agenda of Satan. In sum, good and evil are not symmetrical, they are different in their nature. Men can be corrupted incrementally towards evil, by inducing them to perform evil acts and not repenting, or indeed celebrating them. But, contrary to centuries of church practice and belief, good cannot be pursued in an analogous fashion. As a result, partial goods may not be better than nothing, but may, in practice, be worse than nothing, since partial goods may sufficiently gratify individuals that they fail to seek a full and coherent answer to life's problem, and instead get stuck on something that helps them feel better, but without providing a sufficient solution to the core problems of this mortal life, and without providing the love, faith and courage to resist the temptations of the world. Good and evil personified. With whom shall you affiliate? Whose vision of life do you affirm? Bruce Charlton. In this era and place, we are called upon to move away from an understanding of life and reality based upon the abstractions to which we, especially intellectuals, have become habituated, and towards a much simpler and more animistic personification. This positively because it is the divinely decided direction of development of men's minds, and negatively because the system of abstractions has been thoroughly confused, subverted, corrupted and, increasingly, inverted, such that those who hold by them are readily turned away from God. In other words, instead of regarding ultimate reality as consisting of abstract concepts such as forces, fields, particles, processes, laws, principles etc., we should be thinking of beings and their relationships. This applies to morality, to good and evil. While I have often tried to explain good as that which is in harmony with God and divine creation, and evil as that which opposes this, what good boils down to is a particular group of beings who have made a commitment to work together in familial relationships. Evil is a shifting coalition of beings who oppose them. Therefore, while good is abstractly summarizable as primary and positive, with evil as secondary and negative, in practice we meet up with good and evil as two sides in a spiritual war, the side affiliated to God the Creator, and the side against God. To what extent there are beings on neither side, I will leave out of this discussion. These two sides are two groups consisting of people and other beings, and two particular personages of God the Creator, and the devil, who is leader, to the extent that there is a leader, of the anti-God coalition. And while, as I said above, there is an asymmetry in the fact that creation is primary and anti-creation is secondary, there is also an asymmetry in the fact that before creation was chaos. And so the anti-God side can, albeit incoherently, since they themselves are created, regard themselves as being in favor of the primordial state, something that is deeper and more fundamental than God-made creation. What this means in practice is that morality presents itself as choosing between two sides, between two rival and incompatible modes of explanation and bases for motivation. We can either affiliate with the God party, or become one of those who oppose God, and who may work expediently together, in temporary alliances, in varying degrees. To put it simply, in deciding on morality, we are invited, or required, to choose between two persons, two beings, of different nature and purposes. Even in trying to opt out from this choice, to make a choice for our own nature and purpose, we find that at any given time and place we are necessarily working for one side, or the other, albeit perhaps not consistently or coherently. Thus, the ultimate moral choice boils down to a preference between God and the devil. How well we make this choice of persons, which is also a choice of serving good versus evil, will depend on the choice itself, and the morality by which that choice is evaluated, but from the God side I would say that the choice can be made with varying depths of consideration. That is, with varying depths of personal responsibility, or else, attempted avoidance of responsibility. For instance, in evaluating the nature of God, we may actively and consciously seek, and perhaps achieve, direct knowledge of God's nature. Or else we might get our ideas of God second-hand, unconsciously, from whatever of culture happens to have impinged upon us, and perhaps motivated by a desire to fit in and do well in society as it is now. And we might determine our preference of God versus devil likewise, by social and socially acceptable evaluations. Or else we might try to go as intuitively deep as we can, such as to confront our inferred nature of God from the most fundamental aspects of ourself that we can attain. But the question fundamentally presents itself as, this being, or that one. God's extended family, or the devil's anti-God coalition. To which group do I most want to belong, which life do I most desire? Apathy. William Wildblood. Apathy is one of the besetting sins of many on the spiritual path, and one you should at all times guard against. You must not become bored with the routine of your daily existence, but continually make efforts to keep things fresh by putting yourself fully into spiritual life. I was told this by my teachers many years ago, and I have been reminded of it recently because I have been feeling somewhat drained of spiritual energy of late. Outwardly the world is what we know it to be, and it's only going to get worse. Western civilization is dead and we live in the ruined remains. Spiritual apostasy, materialism, mass immigration, feminism and so on have finished it off, and we only fail to see this because of the legacy that was built up which keeps us going for the time being. Sometimes it seems that there is nothing to be done, so why even try? That, dear readers, is a typical temptation of the evil influences which constantly assail the disciple, and it is one we should disregard. We cannot know what our efforts in this direction might accomplish, outwardly or inwardly, and nor should we be concerned about that. Our responsibility is to fight the good fight at all times and not worry about the results. We just need to proclaim the truth as best we can and let God do the rest. But if we feel it, we must in some way live it. We must never be discouraged by apparent lack of positive outcome either in our outer work or spiritual exercises. I say this because it is precisely this feeling that what we do bears no fruit that can lead to a sense of apathy. But we should not allow ourselves to be discouraged. The sense of futility is at once a test of our resolve and our mettle, and also a ploy of the dark forces to derail us from spiritual endeavor. Slothfulness is one of the 7 deadly sins. At first glance, it doesn't seem like such a bad sin. It's not like anger or greed or lust, which we might think of as fiery sins. Sloth is more of an earthy sin, a sin of weight and depression and negativity. It may be passive more than overtly active, but it is no less a sin because it is rejecting God. God is life and sloth is a kind of giving in to death. There is a theological vice called acedia, and this is the same thing. It is spiritual laziness that leads to inertia, and that is just what the devil wants because it means he has successfully sidetracked us from spiritual effort. The enthusiasm we may once have had, an energy that fired us up for the spiritual path, has dissipated and we become discouraged, to the point that we cease to strive. Our belief becomes weaker and may even fade altogether, though we don't realize it. We may still lead an outwardly spiritual life, but the passion has been replaced by convention and habit. What's the solution? First, acknowledge the problem. Then re-engage. Pull yourself together. Slothfulness is lack of spiritual energy, so you need to reanimate yourself through meditation and prayer and concentration on the good, the beautiful and the true. These are all in hiding at the moment, so you need to search them out, but they will be revealed to those who make concerted efforts and do not allow themselves to fall prey to apathy. Incoherent thinking can now be permanent because of modern man's rejection of animistic thinking, also incapacity and disinclination for rigorous abstraction. Bruce Charlton. It is striking that modern man is now in a situation where he is incapable of detecting and reacting against even gross incoherence among his beliefs and actions. Mainstream narratives might reverse over the space of days, and continue to fluctuate, yet modern man carries on respecting and obeying institutions that, one would have though obviously, are indifferent to truth and addicted to dishonesty. The capacity for people to believe and act upon arbitrary assertions, contradictions to common sense and direct personal experience, and massive lies, are among the more remarkable aspects of this pervasive disorganization of thought. This seems to be something recent, and related to modernity, since there are no historical examples of such gross incoherence. I think the reason is that historical man was, substantially, an animistic thinker, who regarded the important entities of this world as living beings with consciousness and purpose. He would allocate these beings according to their inferred motivations, e.g. benign or hostile, and evaluate the world in accordance with these assumptions. Ancient man might turn out to be mistaken about imputed character of beings, might blame entities for doing things which modern man regards as otherwise explicable, as when a tree falling might be blamed for murdering a child. But it was easy to keep track of the logic of things, and to see whether they made overall sense, easy, because this style of thinking is spontaneous and natural to human beings. Such anthropomorphic thinking is altogether absent from official, media and public discourse. Modern man has been entrained to reject personified, anthropomorphic, thinking as childlike and primitive. We have been taught that instead men ought to think in terms of abstractions, such as those derived from science, mathematics, economics, sociology, management etc. The always implied and sometimes explicit use of abstractions occurs primarily when the leadership class desire to make their choices seem entailed, objectively necessary, as when the science is claimed to dictate a course of action. Or when it is convenient to portray some decision or event as impersonally caused, or some unpredictably random event. Such abstractions are also readily introduced whenever required to displace blame away from the leadership class or their favored individuals or groups. Yet there may be a switch back to animistic/blame thinking, i.e. to imputing character and intent to persons or groups, whenever convenient for the purposes of scapegoating disfavored individuals or groups. Or simply for firing up public discourse, for example inducing fear, anger, hatred, resentment, despair. In other words, one major source of endemic and persistent incoherence in the thinking of modern men is switching back and forth between animistic and abstract modes of reasoning. The usual answer proposed is that animistic thinking needs to be more completely excluded, with the idea that abstraction is more rigorous and objective, and ought to be sufficient. So if the law becomes incoherent and unpredictable because of imputed motivations and natures, i.e. anthropomorphism rooted in different attitudes to different individuals or groups, the call is typically for greater coherence between laws and objectivity in implementation of laws. Yet, somehow, this never happens, but instead the opposite, and the situation gets ever worse. This is because a minority of people are capable of abstract thinking, and therefore cannot be convinced by it. Furthermore, of those capable of abstraction, extremely few will deploy it by aiming at absolute truth all of the time and in all things, and instead nearly all abstractors will use their ability for reasons of personal expediency, to promote their own short or long-term interests. And the reason that so few people will use abstraction truthfully is that, in our godless, unspiritual, hedonic society, there is no ultimate or personally compelling reason to be truthful. To live by truth entails someone valuing truth transcendently, that is, above, beyond, and more than he values the risks and benefits of this worldly gratification. Such an attitude to truth is rare historically, and largely confined to a minority of people in some Christian societies, or those who have been raised with such Christian values. Such a minority included scientists from the 1700s to the middle 20th century in Britain, and indeed many academics and scholars in this same period. But there are, so far as I'm aware, no such groups of significant size or influence nowadays. Furthermore, even in these most selective of truth-driven groups, the strict truthfulness only applied to specific sub-areas of human existence, not to life as a whole. So, even when scientists were completely honest in relation to their scientific work, they were not so honest, and might indeed be dishonest, in other areas of human life, religion, interpersonal relations including sexuality, money dealings. My conclusion is that in a world where abstraction is impossible and unwanted, if we are to attain coherence of thinking that is also sufficiently strong and motivating to dominate our lives, there needs to be a conscious and deliberately chosen restoration of animistic thinking. We need, as our bottom line understanding of reality, to regard this actual world as consisting of many living beings with consciousness and distinctive motivations, engaged in purposive relationships. The above argument is based upon pragmatic considerations, but, of course, as I have often said, I believe that ultimate metaphysical reality indeed primarily consists of beings in relationships, and that abstractions are at best only secondary, selective and summarized models of animistic reality. This is a living universe, created by a personal God, and we would do well to remember and affirm the fact. What is a church? Bruce Charlton. I find the way some people talk of churches to be slippery to the point of dishonest. In particular, many people elide the difference between a, typically small, group of people bound by a personal, often familial, relationship, and very large, bureaucratic, hierarchical, subspecialized, explicitly regulated, organizations. To me, this resembles another common, and deplorable, merging conceptualization, which is to call marriage and the family social institutions. This phraseology is a gross reduction of fundamental aspects of the proper and ideal human life, to a simple abstract model of functionality. To equate a family/extended family with a bureaucratic institution, on the basis of a few analogies, or a shared functionality, is an extreme of prejudiced modernist positivism, which is itself anti-spiritual and materialistic. This is important because the large, bureaucratic, corporate Christian churches have become net corrupt, net harmful. Which means that the possibility of a genuinely Christian group life needs to move away from socially recognized and sustained institutions, and towards non-institutional forms of the Christian life. For there to exist non-institutional forms of Christian life, i.e. outside of the totalitarian system, there must be a recognition that some human groups are, or can be, not institutions. And this is where familial forms of Christianity could and should come in, by which I mean groups that cohere because of love between a particular set of persons, rather than because they are structured organizations. Unless we distinguish such love-based Christian groups, and conceptually separate them from the corporate churches, we are colluding with the powers of evil, who aim at treating all forms of human association as formal institutions, and thereby bringing all kinds of human association under the purposively evil control systems of totalitarian bureaucracy. The ultra-orthodox of the mainstream, self-identified, Christian churches are unrepentant sinners. Bruce Charlton. It is clear to me that the real Christians who remain, so far as they themselves are concerned, faithful and loyal members of the mainstream Christian churches, I shall call them the ultra-orthodox, are actually romantic Christians. But not only without knowing it, but often in denial of the fact. And to be in denial of a truth is to be an unrepentant sinner. Thus, the ultra-orthodox are extremely selective in their conceptualization of the true church, having adopted a, sometimes, tiny minority understanding of the identity and stance of what their church really is, while simultaneously asserting, often with aggressive dogmatism, that the tiny minority stance they regard as true church is objectively so. Well, no amount of aggressive dogmatism, bluff, bluster, or argument can conceal the fact that the ultra-orthodox are working on the basis of fundamental, i.e. metaphysical, assumptions concerning the nature and doctrines of their churches that they themselves have chosen, yet the core assertion of the ultra-orthodox is that the way they have reasoned to reach their position is the one and single truly objective mode of reasoning that is valid for their church. This kind of paradox is, indeed, the only way to be ultra-orthodox in the modern West. Traditional orthodoxy was possible only in a society in which a particular church dominated, and permeated the society such that all who were raised within the church would, unconsciously, and passively, absorb the same fundamental assumptions. Nobody in the modern West has had such an experience and upbringing for several generations, therefore, there is always a choice between rival conceptualizations of the real/true/good essential nature of the church. And that choice cannot be made objectively, impartially, by necessity, without having already made a choice between assumptions. It is this initial act of choosing that the ultra-orthodox conceal from themselves, by their smokescreen of aggressive dogmatism. The aggressive dogmatism of the ultra-orthodox is therefore a kind of emotional self-management, a self-deception, a kind of therapeutic confidence builder and sustainer, whereby doubt is buried beneath externalized anger at those who refuse to accept the falsehood that the process of becoming ultra-orthodox is merely a matter of accepting that which is objectively undeniable. Differently put, I infer that the ultra-orthodox are, self-deceptively, tapping the psychological energies generated by their own inner conflicts, in order to fuel their motivations. It is their suppressed knowledge of self-contradiction that powers the surface level of confrontational aggressive dogmatism. In a world where strong and long-term motivation is so hard to find, this kind of burning intensity is addictive, consequently hard to give up on. Of course, once a closed cycle of reasoning has been assumed, then everything makes sense to one who is within that circle. Yet, anybody outside of the circles of assumption can perceive that the whole thing is rooted in a concealed and denied personal choice of assumptions. As I have said before, ultra-orthodox Christians are actually romantic Christians in denial, and the problem is that this is dishonest, hence is rooted in unrepented sin. Ultra-orthodoxy of whatever church is, for these reasons, an unstable and transitional spiritual state. Unstable, because they are trying to avoid ultimate personal responsibility for what, in fact, they have personally decided, and instead claim to be merely obedient to the external and primary authority of their church. And, late or soon, they will be brought to decide between the two options. Therefore, to remain on the side of truth and good, either the ultra-orthodox will eventually, perhaps after death, need to acknowledge the personal basis of their convictions, will need, in other words, to take individual responsibility for their faith. Or else they will, presumably, suffer the inevitable consequences of unrepented sin. PSYOPS damage thinking, so as to occlude the fact that thinking is damaged. Bruce Charlton. An incredibly eerie thought came to me just now after reading over a typed page in which I describe the Black Iron Prison occluding us in such a way that we can't even tell we are occluded. Philip K. Dick, Exegesis, Sept. October 1978, Folder 19. As I have often said, there is never just one thing wrong when there are chronic and adverse trends, but always also a second thing, which overcomes corrective feedback and makes possible the sustaining of the first fault. This is the case with those pervasive, unremitting and accelerating PSYOPs practiced upon Western populations, and, even more so, on the managerial/intellectual classes of these populations, by officialdom, corporations and the mass media. I means the multiple false and arbitrary claims, and gross, self-contradictory incoherences, which, nonetheless, must be believed and supported as objective facts. What is at work here is a twofold strategy of occluding, blocking, human thinking. The actual processes of thinking are being damaged, and also this damage prevents people from recognizing that their thinking is being damaged. We find that modern man cannot, apparently, apply universal common sense to social situations, fails to recognize and learn from repeated personal experiences, is unable/unwilling to infer evil intention from manifold evil actions, and gets blocked by panic and incomprehension when confronted by even a two-step logical chain, because of A and B, then C. This is what happens, here and now, but why is it possible for the masses to be thus manipulated? And why did it not happen in the past and in all other societies? Again, the answer is twofold, at least twofold. One factor is the presence of the mass media, and its innate addictive nature and addictive properties. The second, which permits this and prevents feedback, is the mass apostasy of Western man, that vast tidal trend of the abandonment of Christianity, the soul, life after death, the world of spirit etc., and adoption of the ideology of materialism/positivism/scientism/leftism with its pseudo-morality of hedonic utilitarianism. Thus, on the one hand, we have unprecedented powers of mind control, while on the other we have the unprecedented vulnerability of self-maimed minds that deny their own purpose, meaning and significance. In the end, We have a world of men who have rendered themselves helplessly confused and blocked from basic understanding, actively embracing further interventions that increase their own mental helplessness and occlusion, all to the point of destroying men's capacity to recognize their own situation. The system is the black iron prison, so it will not help its encaged mass victims, and the BOP extends to include the churches, academia, education, arts, and all other potential mainstream sources of spiritual guidance. The answer is clear, simple, and within the grasp of a child, but for exactly that reason it is unacceptable to modern man. The bad news is that each man can only help himself because no external help is to be had. The good news is that any and every man is capable of helping himself, of initiating a sequence of events leading to his own escape from the mental toils of the BIP. It's all a matter of what he most wants. The role of the individual in life. Bruce Charlton. As so often, the two most available mainstream options are both wrong, ineffective, and unsatisfying when it comes to my role in life. On the one hand, there is a conceptualization of religion that regards the church, its tradition, rituals and practices, as an objective and overwhelming reality, to which the individual must conform. The church does not need me, but I need the church. The church objectively is, while I am just subjectivity. I can recall this as a child, the dull, deadening weight of Christianity as I experienced it. It was something that pressed on me in a crushing way, always trying to shape and mold me, yet offering none of the future excitement, hope, engagement that I found in, for example, science, literature, music when I contemplated a life in them. I felt I personally could contribute to the arts, philosophy, etc., in a way that was impossible for religion, therefore the future was one of being actively entwined with life unfolding, rather than incrementally being squeezed into standard shapes in a set pattern. Yet the other option of these times was also hopeless. The idea of self-development, the idea that each man would make his own world, the ideas of the relativity of truth and values. These were experienced as toxic, because such a freedom and creativity is at the price of its irrelevance. We can believe whatever we want, but none of it matters. We can explore human relationships in unconstrained fashion, but in the end it is just a game of mutual manipulation and attempted exploitation. We can do whatever we feel we desire, but in the end we die and all is washed away. Nothing really matters, nothing lasts. When life is no more than whatever I want, then it is meaningless, purposeless, wearisome, and demotivating because there is no point in doing what will not lastingly satisfy. It is just a matter of doing whatever is easiest, short-term pleasantest, and of not thinking about the future, because the future is irrelevant to the present, unpredictable, and never adds up. Both these options are wrong and utterly unsatisfying. And that dissatisfaction means that life must be futile, if church and subjectivism are the only options. What is needed is something else quite simple to state, which is that we need to live in a way that recognizes both the objective reality of a life beyond ourselves, and also that we personally, our subjectivity, our efforts and aspirations, will be able, in principle, to make a difference to objective reality. The trouble is that our usual mainstream, and going back to ancient times, assumptions about objectivity and subjectivity, about reality and the human mind, are such that we keep on channeling the possibilities down to just the two above. Either subjectivity conforms to objective reality, and subjectivity is some kind of an irrelevant illusion, or, if subjectivity is all there is, then we fall into some kind of nightmarish solipsism of life as a random dream nightmare. This is why I return over and again to the need to understand and expose our underlying metaphysical assumptions, i.e. our basic conceptual model of reality, and to revise them. We need a picture of objective reality in which we, each and personally, can change objective reality, which must therefore be one in which objective reality is known to be dynamic, developmental, evolutionary. however we formulate it, and any specific and communicable formulation, or state-able model, is bound to be incomplete and distorted, compared with the boundless and openly interconnected nature of reality. We need to have this kind of picture in mind, if we are to envisage life in a way that is both motivating and true. At the level of communication, it sounds unsatisfactory. But we are part of creation, as well as participants. We are children of God, the primary creator, as well as immortal beings with agency. At the ultimate level, beyond the capacity of symbolic representations, such as language, we have this experiential knowledge of ourselves and of reality. We have lived through a vast, cosmic, background of events, all of which form that ground of understanding which makes possible a sufficient grasp of our role in life. The choices of spiritual development made by all beings. Bruce Charlton. The primary reality is of beings who, at first, existed as individuals dwelling in chaos, until God's creation arose. The first choice was whether to dwell in creation, whether to join in with the God's project of creation. This incarnated mortal world consists of those who made this choice. But some beings who dwell in creation desire to live in harmony with God's plans, while others live in opposition to them, for example, desiring to exploit their situation at the expense of harmony. So that is the second choice, to live in harmony, or opposition, with divine creation. This mortal life is what might be termed temporary creation and is finite, such that every incarnated being that inhabits it will undergo entropic decline tending towards death, in which the spirit will separate from the material. After the point of death, there is a choice of whether to move on to permanent creation, which is heaven, or not. To move on to heaven entails that each being makes an eternal commitment to live by love, and to reject all that is incompatible with love, i.e. sin. So that is the next choice, repentance and resurrection to life everlasting, i.e. without entropy, in that part of creation called heaven, or to remain out with heaven in some way or another. Of those beings who enter heaven, by following Jesus Christ, who is the unique guide from discarnate spirit through to resurrection, there is a further and ongoing choice, which is how far to proceed with consciousness. In other words, the choice of how conscious do I wish to become. This choice applies to all beings, but all beings are unique individuals, albeit apparently they fall into broad and continuously varying categories, such as men, animals, plants and minerals. All of these categories are considered to be living beings, purposive, conscious, but in different ways and to different degrees. If we focus on men, there is a choice of how much consciousness we desire to develop over long term of eternity. The top level of consciousness is to become like God, a full creator, albeit within God's primary creation. Lower levels of man's consciousness can be understood as analogous to the different developmental stages of men. For example, baby, young child, pre-adolescent, adult. But not a permanent adolescent. That is not an option in heaven, because that phase meant to be merely transitional, which is why the powers of purposive evil strive to make modern man desire to remain a permanent adolescent, i.e. perpetuating this desire can only lead to rejection of the divine. That, then, is the final choice of spiritual development made by subclasses of beings, choosing to become fully divine, and a grown-up child of God, or some lower and lesser degree of consciousness. I say lower and lesser, yet this is the destiny and desire of some beings, whose nature is such that they do not have a fully divine desiring disposition. These natural children will become beings that, to some variable extent, will passively, and less than fully consciously, be controlled to attain harmony with the other beings of heaven, in a top-down fashion by God, or God's agents. Such are the choices. Jesus Christ or Christianity does not make men good. Bruce Charlton. The idea that Jesus came to make us good or that this is the purpose of Christianity, is a pernicious misunderstanding or deliberate distortion, despite that exactly this has been a mainstream belief through most of history since Jesus. People have been arguing for nearly 2,000 years about whether devout and practicing Christians are more, or less, good than the alternatives. By now it is clear that such arguments are merely circular, depending on definitions, and differential priorities of what counts as good that are themselves dependent on whether one is a Christian or not, and how Christianity is understood. One of the great benefits of these most evil times, is that such matters are clearer and easier to understand now than ever before. Now we have, what seem to Christians, to be gross evils and lies propagated officially and by all major social institutions as good, true, necessary, and Christian ideas regarded as evil. And most Christian churches taking the official line, on several or all of the strategies that sustain exactly such evils and lies. In the past we had other religions opposed to Christianity, and a considerable overlap of values, different religions more a matter of different priorities given to values, than wholly different values. But now we have a system of ideology, not religion, that imposes value inversions opposed to Christianity. Thus, surface differences in understandings and measures of good are rooted in different deep assumptions on each side, such that the very meaning of good is what is at issue. In such a situation it makes no sense even to argue about whether or not Christianity makes men good. What must instead be considered, is the much more fundamental issue of whether the Christian understanding of good is superior to rival understandings, and why. From what grounds can an individual Christian read the Bible critically, or not at all? Bruce Charlton. It ought to be obvious, as of 2023, that reading the Bible with care and attention, and believing it is true, does not make somebody a Christian, because different people, and different churches, get extremely different things from reading the Bible, or the New Testament, or the Gospels. After all, most of the highest status scriptural scholars have, for several generations, been theological liberals in one or many respects, whose understandings contradict those of the past, and each other, and change through time like any other academic fashion. I have found that, what I regard in myself as rigorous Christian reflection, has led me to set aside more and more of the Bible as wrong. This fact points to the idea of Christianity without the Bible, which points at a recognition that the essence of following Jesus may, potentially, be independent of self-identified culture and belief systems adopted in this mortal life. As a matter of history, I, and most Christians, start out with a collection of culturally injected beliefs about Jesus, many of which are misunderstood, several of which are contradictory, others of which have been deliberately distorted, for evil ends, and some of which are wholly fabricated. Therefore, it is inevitable and necessary that much of developing Christian activity will entail discarding what are recognized as wrong ideas, supposedly derived from the Bible. But this kind of attritional process of discarding needs to be based on Christian principles, i.e. on some more fundamental and prior understanding of the true nature of Jesus Christ, his work, and his teachings, if it is not to be merely a matter of tailoring Christianity to fit whatever we happen currently to want in our mortal lives or is expedient from a social perspective, as so obviously happens with liberal Christianity. How, then, can we know of and about Jesus, aside from, and more fundamentally than, church traditions and the Bible? There are actually many possibilities for alternative knowledge of Jesus, some of which include knowledge carried over from our premortal life as spirits, knowledge from our here and now interactions with the Holy Ghost, via prayer and or meditation, and from intuition, meaning knowledge derived from that which is divine within each man, as part of our all being sons and daughters of God. As a backstop, for those, in the past, as well as present and future, who have zero valid knowledge of Jesus, yet who innately desire his gift of resurrected eternal life in heaven, we will all be given a chance to know and follow Jesus after our mortal death. So access to the Bible, and an accurate interpretations of its content, is not essential for salvation. Indeed, it would be astonishing if God the Creator, who loves all men as his children, had made things such that the Bible was essential. And the same applies to the church, whichever church that may be. Church is not essential to salvation. The proper attitude, therefore, is to evaluate and discern whatever is helpful from the Bible and churches, and to reject the rest, from a basis of taking fullest personal responsibility for our faith. And to value and develop our direct and interpersonal ways of attaining valid Christian knowledge, those that are least affected by culture, propaganda, and the errors and evils of other men. Scrubbing the floor. William Wildblood. The greatest barrier to spiritual progress is pride. I am aware of this failing in myself, but I believe we all have pride in some form or another because it is part of being human, and having a human ego. In a way, it is both necessary and inevitable because it goes along with the development of a strong self, and we need a strong self in order to be fully individual, which is the purpose of us as created beings. That being said, though perhaps inevitable up to a point and maybe even useful at a certain stage in our evolutionary unfoldment, pride must be overcome, or, from being an initial source of strength for a developing ego, it becomes a chain that binds us to the earth, and from there it locks us up in a prison of separation from life. Pride in self limits us to the self, and the more it does so, the more the self contracts, becoming harder and heavier. Density and weight equate to darkness. Pride leads to hell, and hell is dead weight and darkness. Scrubbing the floor engenders humility. My teachers told me the reason I had come back to earth was to learn humility. That's come back, not come. I know that many readers of this blog are Christian, and most Christians don't believe in reincarnation, but I do, though whether it applies to every soul on the planet or only some I couldn't say. One cannot assume we all are going through precisely the same type of training, and there are many dimensions of being that the evolving soul can experience. Nonetheless, I do believe that reincarnation is a major mechanism for the development of the human soul. But it is voluntary. Souls on higher planes may reach a point at which they can go no further unless they have experience in the material realm, and so they return, guided by their teachers. I am not saying that heaven and hell do not exist and that our choices and actions here do not determine our post-mortem state, but it may be that most people only reach a definitive and determining state at the end of a cycle of earthly incarnations. There are many planes of being in the universe which extends much further on the vertical axis than it does on the horizontal one. We live in an age in which the desire for fame and power and admiration has reached an alarmingly high level, pushed to even more excessive heights by the technology we have at our disposal. This means we live in an age in which pride and lack of humility are potentially more present in a wider section of the population than ever before. This is just one more reason why it is such a spiritually perilous time in which to be alive, though the positive side to this is that where there is great risk there can also be great opportunity. Fame and power are very much two-edged swords, and what Jesus said about rich people going to heaven applies in just the same way to those with fame and power. So be careful what you wish for. With respect to fame and power, you might think that the most spiritually advanced people are the spiritual leaders, the popes, Dalai Lamas, gurus, swamis, etc., but this is by no means necessarily the case. In fact, a public spiritual position often has a strong worldly element to it, and can be a corrupting influence. Often the greatest souls have no position. One should not have an inverted spiritual snobbery about this or use it as an excuse for failure, but sometimes for humility to be more than skin deep the soul must be reduced to scrubbing the floor, figuratively at least. In his short novel The Great Divorce, which concerns the split between heaven and hell, C.S. Lewis has a character in heaven whom the narrator initially mistakes for the Virgin Mary herself because of her beauty, and the glory that surrounds her. She is in fact Sarah Smith from Golders Green, a worldly nobody who led a hard and obscure life but who has been transfigured by love. It may indeed have been the hardness and obscurity of her life that were the conditions that polished her soul, though they are certainly not enough on their own. She would have had to have responded to them in a spiritually mature and creative way, accepting what God sent her with gratitude and humility, a lesson for us all. The highest form of prayer I can imagine. Bruce Charlton. All sincere prayer is good, but some forms are higher than others, and it is reasonable to expect the form to develop as our consciousness develops through stages of life. As a child, our prayer tends to be petitionary, asking for things to happen, and also propitiatory, begging for things not to happen, including making deals with God. If you do X for me, then I will do Y for you. This form of praying could be characterized as excessively egotistical, in the sense that it is often the surface, personality and this worldly me that is talking to God. As if we knew better than God what God ought to be doing. Later in life, we may become aware of this egotism, and self-assertion as a major barrier, standing between us and God. Then we may aim for an ideal of sitting before God, and of prayer as silent, contemplative, and opening to allow God to take over. The idea of removing the self, and our own will, so that only God's will is done. Yet this ideal of self-effacing prayer is so passive as to be aiming implicitly to delete ourselves from divine creation. We are implicitly assuming that it would be better if we personally did not exist, better if we never had been born, which means as if we were never created by God. Yet God did create us, and presumably He knew His business. He would hardly have created us if the ideal was then for us to disappear into His creation. I may not actually be able to do it reliably, but I can see that what God would most want from us is not to sit in a passive, obedient merely to absorb and transmit divine creation, as if we were not there, because this would add nothing to God's creation. Admittedly, self-effacing prayer removes the problem of sin, and stops us from actually fighting against God's creation and will. And this is desirable. But surely God created us for positive reasons, to do something good, not merely to refrain from doing bad things. God created us, I believe, so that we may choose to develop such as to join our personal creativity and love to that of God. We live so as to add to creation, by our continuing existence. Yes, to do this efficiently, to avoid fighting ourselves, we would indeed need to eliminate sin and evil from our will, we need to cease to oppose divine creation, but we will also need to add our bit to creation. Therefore, I believe that prayer should ideally be personally active and creative, and therefore not ego-less, self-effacing and contemplative. Exactly this has been made possible to us through the work of Jesus Christ, by resurrection to eternal life in heaven. In heaven, and after resurrection, the ideal can become eternal reality. But how do we actually do this, here and now, during mortal life and on this side of resurrection? For a start, in this mortal life, it cannot be done in any complete and permanent way from our own willpower, effort and practice, because we are all indeed tainted by sin and egotism, and selfishness that cannot be eradicated, or at least not without also eradicating the possibility of active, personal and creative prayer. The highest form of prayer is, however, possible here and now, so long as we accept it will be brief and usually partial in degree, as are all attainments in this mortal life, yet still of permanent value. Whatever actually is achieved in this temporary life on earth, will be retained, will be added to the totality of eternal divine creation, and then potentially experienced forever by those who are resurrected to heaven. In thought much is possible, and to any person, that is not possible in the constrained material realm. By knowing what we most want, what we are aiming at, then we are able to attain it in our thinking. Thinking what? Well, for instance thinking about our own death and resurrection, and about heaven. Thinking about our deepest good desires, thinking on that we value most deeply and permanently, thinking on those we love, on what we value in those we love. Thinking on the truth, beauty and virtue of God's creation, and on our own thoughts and deeds that add to this creation, maybe in practice, but certainly adding to creation in thought, in potential. Thinking in a spirit of gratitude to God and affirmation of divine creation, with intent to contribute to it. In essence, perhaps, by thinking on joy and love in our own lives and ideal thoughts, and consecrating these joys and loves to God's creation. In our imagination, adding our joys to the permanence, development, and eternal growth of creation. Such seems to me the highest form of prayer.